Do you think Sherlock Holmes would be a podcaster nowadays? Is he a big enough show-off to want to share his thoughts that way? Or John Watson would, presumably.
John Watson would, and I think there even is a podcast that's ostensibly based around the true crime format that's supposedly hosted by Watson and Holmes. And they
Okay.
re-dramatize the cases a little bit. Would Sherlock Holmes be a podcaster? No, I don't think so. Because as he says, the work is a reward in and of itself, and he doesn't want to take any notoriety or any claim for the cases that he solves. Now, of course, we see him sort of undo that opinion throughout the course of the canon, but I'm going to stick with that initial statement that he makes. I think it's in The Sign of the Four, where he says the work itself is its own reward.
I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. My special guest today is Nick Cardillo, who is an authority on Sherlock Holmes and indeed the author of several Sherlock Holmes pastiches. But today we're here to talk about Sherlock Holmes movies, and specifically his 10 favourite ones, or rather, in part 1, the first 4 of his favourites, followed by part 2, in which we'll explore the other 6. There was a lot to say, and we had to split the podcast up into 2 parts. So here we are, Nick. Let's get cracking. Nick Cardillo, welcome back to the podcast. I can't believe I sucked you back into my web of mystery and suspense. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome.
I'm thrilled to be back. Thank you so much.
This is an absolute thrill because we're going to talk about Sherlock Holmes, and you're a proper Sherlockian. So I want to hear all about it. What got you interested as someone who is a fan and then who's actually been writing their own Sherlock Holmes stories and more?
I like to say that Sherlock Holmes has been a part of my life for most of my life. I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and I was gifted a copy of the Great Illustrated Classics children's edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And this book included 3 abridged illustrated adaptations of The Red-Headed League, The Speckled Band, and The Copper Beeches. To this day, they're 3 of my absolute favorite of the original short stories. And I just devoured this book. I was on the edge of my seat wanting to know what was the Red-Headed League all about? What did the Speckled Band mean? What was happening to Miss Violet Hunter as she took her mysterious new job at the Copper Beeches? And around the same time that I was gifted this book, a teacher friend of ours found out that I was as enthusiastic as I was about the stories, and so he lent me the DVD collection of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, starring Jeremy Brett and David Burke. And so, right from the beginning, I was reading these stories, watching them on TV, and I just became voracious after that, just wanting to consume as much as I possibly could. And that led to actually reading the original Conan Doyle stories for themselves, seeking out all of these different adaptations, scouring the internet for these more obscure versions that I had never heard of and that I needed to track down. And again, it was a passion of mine growing up through high school into college. How I ended up started writing my own stories. Looking back on it, I was probably creating my own Sherlock Holmes stories before I could properly even fully form story ideas and sentences, writing them down. I was drawing new adventures for Holmes and Watson. And in high school, I wrote a pastiche, a short story, and sort of filed it away as a project that I just wanted to see for myself how well I thought that I could capture the essence, the tone of Doyle, the voice of Holmes and Watson, and the kinds of stories that he was telling. And in the meantime, I was working as the entertainment editor for my high school newspaper. And in this quote unquote position of power, I decided that I was going to write a column about Sherlock Holmes and his impact on the world from inception through today. And I decided that I was going to reach out to some prominent voices in the Sherlockian community as my sources for quotes. So among them, I reached out to the author Lindsay Fay. I wrote to the late, great Sherlockian David Stuart Davies. And they were all very, very kind and considerate in giving me some wonderful resources. I also wrote to Sherlockian writer and editor extraordinaire David Markham, who at the time was already knee deep in the MX book of New Sherlock Holmes short stories collection, which already was the largest collection of new Sherlock Holmes pastiches. And I interviewed him. He gave me some great information for my column. And then, sort of on a whim, not really expecting anything in return, I took this story that I had written, dusted it off out of the drawer, and emailed it over to him just to say, if there's going to be someone who can give me a professional opinion on how I've succeeded here, he is the one. And he wrote me back a couple of days later and said, how would I like to be in the next installment of the anthology? And I was absolutely over the moon. And that's began an association where for several years, at least once or twice a year, the collections were biannual at that time. I would have a story that appeared in at least one of them. And it soon got to be the point where I had enough under my belt that I was able to put out my own collection. And so 2018, I collected half a dozen short stories together and released The Feats of Sherlock Holmes. And it was my first collection of short stories. And a sequel volume followed in 2021 called The Improbable Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. After that, I got involved in writing short stories for Belanger books, also Sherlock Holmes stories. Then they began reprinting the August Derleth pulp detective Solar Ponds, who's very much a Sherlock Holmes copycat, and they were creating new Solar Ponds short stories. So I contributed to some of those anthologies as well. And that really is what brings us to this point today.
Tell me a little bit about your radio adventures with Sherlock Holmes, though.
Yes, I discovered the Imagination Theater, Jim French Productions, which I believe is run out of the West Coast in the United States. And since the early 2000s, they've been running a radio series, The Further Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And I've always loved radio adaptations. It's something that you and I share, Sergio, that we love radio as a medium. And I still say that to this day, some of the best Sherlock Holmes material, for the lack of a better word, of any kind, is the BBC series starring Clive Merrison and Michael Williams. They are absolutely brilliant as Holmes and Watson. And their own Further Adventures of Sherlock Holmes series with Andrew Sachs is also really, really good. So I decided to, again, sort of just see if I could do it. And I wrote a radio script dramatizing one of my own short stories and sent it off to their head writer, and was very gratified to get a positive response. Not long afterward, they commissioned my script, and about a year or so ago, I wrote a second one for them, again, also based on one of my own short stories. So I've sort of toyed with going back to the idea, but creative endeavors are leading me in a different direction at this time. So we won't say no, that there won't be more radio Sherlock Holmes, but it's a tantalizing opportunity.
Well, I look forward to that. Okay, but today we're going to talk about movies. We're ignoring television, we're ignoring radio, we're ignoring books, although, of course, some of these have genuine literary origins. And instead, we're going to talk about, well, it's your top 10 favourite Sherlock Holmes movies. Is that fair? Is that really, truly your top 10 favourites, or is it just your top 10 favourites today?
It's probably top 10 favorites today. When you suggested that we were going to have this conversation, I thought again, and it's not a situation that's unique to Sherlock Holmes, but he is a character who is so much more at home on television. And I knew that we couldn't open that can of worms, because how are we going to discuss, a singular episode of the Jeremy Brett series or the Ronald Howard TV series, against a Basil Rathbone movie or against the Private Life of Sherlock Holmes? They're very different kettles of fish. So I thought, you know what, we're gonna stick to major films, major motion pictures, and 10 seemed like a nice round number to choose. I think also will do a nice job of giving us a very well-rounded overview of what the history of Holmes has been like on the big screen.
And so you've very handily broken them down into certain categories. And so we start with the canonical Holmes. And our first one, tell us about your first choice. So I should say this is basically completely chronological, isn't it? So we're not
Yes.
doing a top 10 in the traditional sense. I mean, I might try and pin you down at the end. I have a single favorite, which I think you know what it is. But this is chronological.
Sure.
And rather wonderfully, I think you've been able to break it down into a series of chronological groupings or clusters that I think is really helpful. So the first one is the canonical Sherlock. So what's your first choice when it comes to the chronological canonical Sherlock?
So I picked from 1939 The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce.
Yay! I love that movie.
Yes, it's a great movie. It occurred to me after I made the selection that you could argue it's rather perverse that we're calling this first section the canonical Sherlock Holmes, in that none of the films that I have chosen are actually based on stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle. They are all pastiches of one type or another. And that's sort of what I was hinting at
Yeah.
when I was talking about Holmes being at home on television. Because there are so many of the short stories, they naturally lend themselves, I think, better to a television format. Even the 4 novels are not very long, and they can be fit into a 90-minute or 100-minute television movie. So, getting that disclaimer out of the way, we can talk
Yeah.
about how much we love The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and what a delightful, delightful film this
Well, it's
is.
a great film, and yet you could argue it's faithless in two special ways because it's got nothing to do with Conan Doyle in terms of a canonical work from the 60s, but also it's supposed to be based on the William Gillette play and just called Sherlock Holmes. And, well, has it got much to do with that play?
No, absolutely not. I think the overlap is the Arthur Hole plays a character named Bassick, who is a henchman of Professor Moriarty, and I believe that he is carried over from the Gillette play. But I wanted to get your opinion on this. Why do you suppose that Fox ostensibly said that this is a film adaptation of the play when it has nothing whatsoever to do with it?
I think partly it was just to do with cachet. I think it was helpful
Mm.
because the play had been popular for so long. I think it also probably helped settle things a little bit with the estate as well. They made a deal with the Conan Doyle estate. By this point, Conan Doyle himself had died, and I think it was Adrian they were sort of dealing with in terms of rights, and they'd made a deal initially for what probably would have been 3 films and then a few more. Didn't exactly come to fruition, and they'd started with Hound of the Baskervilles because let's face it, usually you start with Hound of the Baskervilles when you want to launch a new Sherlock Holmes, and doesn't always work, does it? Because it looks good on paper and actually it's very hard to do properly, but we'll get to that. In this case, the Gillette play, I don't know if they actually already owned it, which is
Mm.
possible, or they made a deal in terms of getting it. But I think they may have started, I suspect, with something a little closer to it. Because I think, is Billy, strictly speaking, a character from the play?
I believe Billy does originate from the play, and then
Yeah,
Conan Doyle incorporated him into a couple of the later short
yeah.
stories.
So there's this odd thing where it was a licensed play, almost the only one that Doyle said, okay, fine, and was very popular, and was, I think, especially popular in America
Hmm.
rather than the UK. I think not to say it wasn't popular, but you know what I mean. It was one of those ones that did well in America. I therefore always assumed it had something to do with that. That it was a way to it gave it that oddly the need to give it an additional imprimatur, having already said it's a licensed Sherlock Holmes film. But oddly enough, as you say, it isn't based on a Sherlock Holmes story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and so it's the next best thing. It's based on a work that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle gave his blessing to. So I
Sure.
guess you're following from Hand of the Baskervilles, which went well, but has that annoying structural problem of just not enough
Hmm.
Sherlock, to one where there's going to be plenty of Sherlock, excellent, and it's going to have his most famous antagonist, because that's the other aspect of it. And I think, and again, that's a character who, strictly speaking, gets referenced in one of the novels, only appears in one of the short stories, although conceivably you could say he's connected to the Red-Headed League. I love that theorizing, right?
Absolutely.
But it helps deal with that aspect of it too. So you got those elements that come in. But yeah, I know it's a little bit nebulous, and I don't think they really wanted to adapt the play, not really. I think it was just convenient, and it was a way of selling it.
Thinking back on it now, I think technically Fox also released the 1932 film Sherlock Holmes, which is the second of the two Clive Brook Sherlock Holmes
Mm.
films. And that is also ostensibly based on the Gillette play, to the extent that it actually has a few of the characters. Alice Faulkner is a character in that film, as she is Holmes's shock horror love interest in the Gillette play. But the reason that I chose Adventures of Sherlock Holmes over Hound of the Baskervilles for this first selection is, as you point out, there's simply more of Holmes in this film. And on this most recent rewatch, getting ready for this discussion, I was blown away by how good Rathbone is in this film in particular. You can tell he is absolutely relishing the opportunity to play Holmes. Famously, when he was cast in Hound of the Baskervilles, he said that the part was meant 12 Hamlets to him. And obviously his opinion of the detective would change over the years, but you get the sense that Rathbone was always fighting against typecasting throughout his entire career. And by 1939, he'd already been a despicable villain in David Copperfield and Captain Blood and famously The Adventures of Robin Hood, and I think was desperate to be a heroic character. There are a lot of critics and historians today who make fun of his baroque over the top performance in a movie I love, Son of Frankenstein, from the same
Oh
year.
yeah, great film.
But you can see Rathbone taking that role fully in his arms and relishing the opportunity to play a hero. And he's doing the same thing in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. He looks phenomenal in the Victorian attire. Also, famously, this is only the second Sherlock Holmes film to be set in period in the Victorian era. Fox does a beautiful job of realizing that period on film. His interplay with Nigel Bruce's Watson is excellent in this movie. Watson, famously played by Nigel Bruce, is a bumbling fool, and he's so endearing in Adventures of
Mm.
Sherlock Holmes. The screenwriters have a wonderful running joke of Watson being annoyed at how much Holmes likes Billy the page boy, that Watson is always making fun of Billy. He's snotty and snobby to Billy, and it's hilarious. Nigel Bruce is doing wonderful work in this movie. Ida Lupino is doing great work in this movie as the woman in peril, the woman in jeopardy. Obviously, you can speak much more to the film noir career of Ida Lupino, but she's an actress who I love, and she's really shines in this part. George Zuko is great as Professor Moriarty. I love the scene when he and Rathbone are sharing a hansom cab right at the beginning of the film,
Yeah.
and Holmes has that beautiful line that he says, "I admire your brain, Moriarty. I admire it so much that I'd like to present it pickled in alcohol to the Royal Medical Society." It's it's a witty script. It's very well done.
You've a magnificent brain, Moriarty. I admire it. I admire it so much, I'd like to present it pickled in alcohol to the London Medical Society.
That would make an interesting exhibit. You're the one man in England clever enough to defeat me. The situation has become impossible.
Have you any suggestions?
I'm going to break you, Holmes. I'm going to bring off right under your nose the most incredible crime of the century, and you'll never suspect it until it's too late. That will be the end of you, Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
You can make the accusation that it's not very mysterious, that we know from the beginning that this is all a scheme by Moriarty. I won't ignore that because it is true. It does take some of the mystery out of the film, but it makes up for that deficiency in a number of places, not the least of which is Rathbone's delightful performance of I Do Love to Be Beside the Seaside at the garden party.
I do like to be beside the seaside. I do like to be beside the sea. I do like to stroll along the prom, where the brass band plays tickety-yom-pom. So just let me be beside the seaside. I'll be beside myself with glee. For there's lots of
Which, depending on who you listen to, is probably the best time that any actor has been sufficiently disguised as Holmes in disguise. I've watched this movie a couple of times with people who the revelation that this music hall performer was Holmes the whole time is a huge shock. It's a really nicely calibrated moment.
Which in the movies, you gotta admit, unless you use CGI, virtually never happens, right? Disguises never convince. You can always tell the actor beneath them, nearly always. So here, go on, yeah.
There's one later that I will fight for as being just as good. But
Okay,
we'll get to that.
We'll get there. But, absolutely, I think that he's superb in it. And again, what's nice to me is that it provides him an opportunity to actually bring us a slightly lighter touch. Because the one thing about Rathbone is that he was apparently a very sober fellow. It's not so much that he lacked humour, but I think he tended to give the impression that he often didn't get the joke. I think that was the kind of the persona that he had. That's what people thought of him. And he was great as heroes. He was great as villains. He was great in swashbucklers. He was great as romantic leads who maybe are a little bit bent. He was a perfectly decent Philo Vance, and so on and so forth. And Sherlock is sort of perfect for him because I think that he can grate that sense of just sort of intensity, but also he gets the opportunity actually to show the kind of the joyful aspect of it, which is, until Jeremy Brett, that doesn't necessarily come across quite as much, especially on television. This idea that actually he loves what it's doing. When Sherlock's right, he loves it. He jumps around and he gets all excited.
Right.
And I think you almost get that sense with Rathbone, particularly when he's playing the scenes with Bruce. I think, and that's what comes across so well. There's just the great camaraderie with Bruce as well, which is crucial. I mean, do you not feel that with you always judge the quality of a Sherlock Holmes adaptation based on how good the Watson is? Deep down, it always seems to me that that's the right thing. And so people, I think, are very much in two camps about Nigel Bruce as Watson. But here, and again, the nice thing about Hound of the Baskervilles and Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, they're A-budget movies. So they look great. They have a proper running time, as it were. Nothing's rushed. And you get to spend time loving the amazing production design.
Absolutely.
The climax looks incredible. It just looks wonderful in terms of the setting and the lighting. It's all wonderful. But you also get those lovely moments, like when Watson's lying down on the cobbled streets, and
yes,
right, and the Bobby turns up. And I was like, "Are you feeling all right, sir?" That sort of thing.
No, I'm dead.
Perhaps I can find a doctor.
I'm a doctor. What's the matter with you?
I'm all right. I was thinking of you.
Why?
But aren't you ill?
Certainly not. I'm dead.
And I adore that. And I just think, no, this is basically getting it right. And I know what you mean. It's sort of disappointing that although there was that I think quite fun mystification that that Moriarty has something planned, but you don't know quite what it is. There's going to be a distraction. And okay, we don't have to get into the whole Bolas thing necessarily. You know, there's got to be an easier way to kill somebody. But
It's
nonetheless,
very Doyle, though. It's very
yeah,
Doyle.
yeah.
As badly aged as some of the tropes are of the mysterious foreign figure from outside the British Empire sort of invading London can be, it's a repeated element of the Conan Doyle stories. And so it feels very apiece with the rest of the canon.
And it has a great sort of hint of strangeness as that scene when Moriarty gets home and you get that playing on the mysterious sort of flute instrument, and what does that all mean, and the plants and all that business, and he's sort of mean to his butler who should have done a better job of looking after the plants, these sorts of things. And it all sort of actually pays off, and it does a nice setup of all of that. Do you not think sometimes that the issues that I think some viewers sometimes have with the stories is that they are, you know, this is the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is the name of the first collection, but they are adventure stories. They're detective stories, but they're not whodunits necessarily at all. Yes, you get what is technically a lockroom mystery or impossible crime story sort of in, you know, how did somebody get killed on that bridge or something, or, you know, and, oh yes, it turns out it's a snake. You know, these sorts of things, and they're not very probable necessarily. If you're going in thinking it's going to be a more modern conception of what the detective story is as a whodunit, you're always going to be a little bit disappointed. It is the character, the atmosphere, and what's wonderful about them, partly because they're so well written. You know, Doyle, you know, was a great prose stylist. You know, he put things so well. You know, it's just like The Dog in the Nighttime. You know, if you don't phrase it as well, it doesn't resonate. There is that, to me, it's the, and we'll come back to this idea, but it seems to me it's the romance of the Victorian era and the Victorian hero, romantic hero in that sense, that you want a Sherlock Holmes story to sell. It's always a slightly Never Never Land idea. So here it's set in faraway Victorian England at the time the film came out. That was, strictly speaking, 40, 50 years earlier. It was within living memory. I mean, Rathbone was nearly 50 at that point. You know, it looks amazing. Apart from anything else, it looks fantastic. I mean, I love that definition that Dorothy Parker had of him, you know, which is two profiles glued together.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know,
and you look at him in profile in these films, and it really is striking. He was a very striking looking actor and perfect for the part, especially when you match him up against the original Paget illustrations. He is the Paget illustration brought to life.
Mea culpa. That's a mistake that a lot of people have made. It wasn't Dorothy Parker, it was actually Mrs. Patrick Campbell who described Basil Rathbone that way, so now you know. He doesn't lack humour, he maybe lacks irony. He doesn't do that, maybe, but he's wonderful in it. You know, and that's just the Rathbone persona. Really. But nonetheless, no, I think it's a great way to kick off your collection of best 10. It's probably could very well be my favourite of the kind of the more, shall we say, the traditional Sherlock Holmes type stories. I think it's the one that I think absolutely works the best. However, moving slightly forward chronologically, we get to another massive favourite. This is where one always gets into a bit of an argument. If one were doing, as we once did, our favourite Rathbone and Bruce film, and there are 14 of them, plus a appearance in a comedy that let's not get into that. The next one in line for the top spot is, I think, the following film, isn't it? Tell us a little bit about The Scarlet Claw.
So I have chosen for the number 2 selection on this list, The Scarlet Claw from 1944, again starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. This is one of the films that was made once the series had shifted over to Universal. This is if not right in the middle of the series. It's coming at the high point creatively for the veritable repertory company that Universal had established for these Sherlock Holmes films. All but one at Universal was directed by Roy William Neill, and you feel him firing on all cylinders when you're watching this film. It's one of, I believe it's the only one in the series that he has a partial writing credit
Yeah,
on. So
absolutely. Yeah.
you feel that this is sort of a passion project for everyone who is involved. And in the commentary track done for this film by David Stewart Davies, he sort of alludes the fact that everyone who has memory of making this film felt that it was something a little bit different, a little bit special as they were going into it. The basic setup of this movie, for those who don't know, is that Holmes and Watson are on vacation in Canada. They are in rural Canada, somewhere outside of Quebec, and a supposed phantom has been roaming the marshlands of the portentously named L'Amour Rouge, or the Red Death, a small village, killing livestock, and has now moved on to ripping out the throats of its human victims, including the wife of the village aristocrat, who, before she died, had written to Holmes, fearing that her life was in danger. And so Holmes and Watson descend upon this small village in search of what obviously transpires to be an all too human agent behind this supposed haunting. As you can tell from this summary, there is a lot being cribbed from The Hound of the Baskervilles in this film. And what I like so much about The Scarlet Claw is that it really does, as I like to say, out Baskerville the 1939 Hound of the Baskervilles. This is 100% blood and thunder gothic. There is not a scene that doesn't go by without howling wind and rolling fog and just a deep, unsettling sense of the macabre and the mysterious. This is one of the high watermarks, I think, just in terms of the universal horror cycle of the 1930s and the 1940s. It stands out as not just a Sherlock Holmes mystery, but it really is a suspenseful horror thriller. You get special photography from John P. Fulton, who was the in-house special effects wizard at Universal, who created famously the invisibility effects in the original The Invisible Man and its multiple sequels. And you get really nasty, really gnarly little details. The titular Scarlet Claw is a 5-pronged garden weeder that is used to rip out the throats of these townsfolk, and the camera lingers on the weapon in Holmes's hand as he's sort of using it to unnerve one of the potential suspects. The really bravura sequence of the entire film is the murder Miles Mander's judge character. This is a scene that predates Psycho, in which the killer dresses up as the judge's female housekeeper and in stark photography lifts up the garden weeder right into the camera and brings it down just out of camera frame. And it's really gruesome. It's shocking, especially for 1944, when there's nothing quite like this going on at Universal at the time, or indeed, I think just horror movies in general at this time.
I really like the Universal Sherlock Holmes films. I think they're great, but very few of them work even remotely as a whodunit, at all. They have other virtues, but this one has all the virtues. It has the advantage of being set in this very, very foggy vision of Montreal, but it's complete Never Never Land. So the truth is, it could be Victorian England, basically, or Victorian France or Victorian Canada, but it functions fantastically well as a whodunit. It is one of the best hidden murderers in the whole cycle.
Absolutely.
That shouldn't matter, but actually it does, because it gives you that extra sense that they've really thought it through very carefully. And I think it just works because, when was the last time you feel you were genuinely fooled by a universal whodunit from the 1940s?
Sure.
Not often.
The strength in the script is also that they managed to pull off the pivot so well, so that relatively early on in the film, Holmes goes out onto the marsh by himself to investigate, and he witnesses the supposed marsh phantom. And it becomes very apparent at that point that this is a man dressed in phosphorescent clothing, another a hint towards the original Hound of the Baskerville source material. And then at that point, the script introduces the notion that the murderer is a deranged former actor. And now we're in a whole different scenario where anyone that we have met up to this point, indeed multiple characters that we have met up to this point, could all have been the same person.
But surely, now that you know who the murderer is, the police...
It's not quite as simple as that. During the time he's lived here, Ramson has undoubtedly established another character for himself, perhaps several others, who are by now familiar to the people of the town of Le Mans Rouge and quite above suspicion. He could be almost anyone in the village. He may even have been your butler, Drake.
This is fantastic.
Yes. Yet Lady Penrose's death is only the beginning. There's no saying where this madman will strike next.
It's the same sort of trick that's, pulled in Agatha Christie or more traditionally plotted whodunit of the period. And they managed to walk the line between this Hound of the Baskervilles inspired opening and this more traditionally Golden Age whodunit in the latter half of the film really, really well.
And again, it's usually so hard to use makeup and so on to disguise people's features successfully. And this one totally get away with it. Also, of course, that fantastic murder sequence you alluded to with the murderer masquerading as the daughter, I think, isn't it? With the Miles Mander character. Is it the daughter?
With the housekeeper.
Housekeeper. Sorry. That's right. Daughter's a different thing. I apologize. Has a very clever bit of editing involved so that in actual fact, you have two actors playing the role.
Yes.
And they're very, very crafty with that. And again, it just tells you just how hard they're working to really sell this idea. And, you just sort of think, wow, they're going to a lot of trouble. But absolutely, I think that in some ways, the Hound of the Baskervilles with Rathbone and Bruce is a decent movie. It's a very entertaining film. It's nicely produced. It's well made. Here, we get a chance for them to do a more dynamic version that involves them both in a very similar kind of story. But that does neatly, I think, take us to the next film on your list, which is what I take is your favourite iteration of The Hound of the Baskervilles. So what's the next one on your list, Nick?
So for number 3, we are going to be discussing The Hound of the Baskervilles from 1959, starring Peter Cushing as Sherlock Holmes, Andre Morel as Dr. Watson, and Christopher Lee as Sir Henry Baskerville. This is the famed Hammer Films production of the Doyle novel.
Which is great fun. In colour!
We both have, I think, a fondness for Hammer Films, do we not?
We do, and at the moment I'm even doing some work for the company, so I can only say nice things about Hammer Films. I literally spent an entire day working on some new supplements that are going to be part of one of their releases that's coming out in June, which may or may not be before or after this podcast is heard. I can attest to the fact that they are absolutely lovely people to work with. But okay, they weren't involved in making films in 1959. Hasn't it got all the great Hammer people in it, one way or another, in front or behind the camera, virtually? The only thing it hasn't got is Jimmy Sangster as the writer, I think.
Yes. So it's a screenplay, I believe, by Peter Bryan.
Yeah.
Former camera operator.
That's right, and he had an accident. Yeah, and so he sort of
screenwriter.
and so started writing instead. There was that family feel at Hammer,
Yeah,
which is so
absolutely.
interesting. Yeah. So yes, screenplay by Peter Bryan.
Peter Bryan also wrote one of my other favorite Hammer films, 1966's The Plague of the Zombies.
Ah, yes.
Which, viewed through a certain lens, almost has a rather Sherlockian, Doylean feel to it, with the intrepid investigator coming down to the countryside to investigate strange goings-on up at the manor house.
And played by?
Again, by Andre Morel.
The greatest story ever written by one of the world's greatest storytellers, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's classic masterpiece of mystery, suspense, and horror, The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Some revolting sacrificial rite has been performed. What depths a human being can sink to.
What human being could have done this?
That is precisely what I intend to find out.
But how can you be so certain that somebody took one of the bishop's spiders and deliberately placed it in Sir Henry's room? That it wasn't in the luggage he brought from South Africa?
Elementary, my dear Watson. There are no tarantulas in South Africa.
This is in the period when Hammer is really getting up off the ground in terms of their gothic horror films. And so you get Cushing and Lee in front of the camera. You get Terence Fisher behind the camera directing. You get the brilliant set design by Bernard Robinson as production designer at this point.
We say Bernard over here, but it's Bernard over there. But at home, he was Bernard Robinson. Yeah.
You get the color cinematography. It's a lush, beautiful film. Even though we don't get many exteriors outside in Victorian London, which is rather interesting. All of the London set portions of this film are stage-bound, but we do get some very evocative location cinematography out on what claims to be Dartmoor. Even though this is not the most faithful adaptation of The Hound of the Baskervilles, it is certainly the one that takes the most advantage of the gothic trappings and the horror elements that are inherent in the Doyle novel. Obviously, Hammer was going to exploit these elements regardless. That's just sort of the trajectory that they were on at this point. They'd done Frankenstein, they'd done Dracula, and so naturally, The Hound of the Baskervilles stands on its own as this gothic masterpiece. It's going to be the natural progression of what they were doing. And if you look at the most famous posters for this film, it's all about the Hound. It's all about the jaws dripping blood. Famously, Cushing is nowhere to be seen on a number of these posters. So Sherlock Holmes, it doesn't feel like it was ever really the selling point to Hammer when they were producing this film. So that's why you get instances like the attempt made on Sir Henry Baskerville's life via tarantula crawling out of his boot and up his arm. And I say, as someone who suffers from crippling arachnophobia, I still have to look away from the screen every time I rewatch this film. I cannot stand it.
It is fascinating how they really emphasize the Gothic, but even go further back. I mean, you get the big prologue, so that becomes like a big chunk of the movie to tell you what happened in the past, and you get that storytelling, and that's all very aggressive and typical and sort of horror tinged as they kind of stalk this poor young maiden, which feels like it could belong to almost any of the classic kind of Gothic horrors from the studio. And then we end up at Baker Street, and it's a sort of classic example. You know, we've got Sherlock sort of playing chess, and Peter Cushing is going to do a lot of finger action with his right index finger, the meerschaum pipe, so on and so forth. And he even gets to wear the deerstalker, of course. And Morel is a fantastic Watson. They made several films together after all. They'd already done their version of 1984. Which had been superb, and they would later go on to do Cash on Demand, which I can't remember if you've seen, but it's just one of the best Hammer thrillers ever.
I cannot say enough nice things about Cash on Demand. It is an absolutely brilliant film.
And it is a fantastic showcase for the two of them, and Richard Vernon, but, you know, basically they're just wonderful in together. So this is great. You know, you get that wonderful opportunity to just see two star actors. Equally the lighting is particularly extravagant. You get those bits of green light creeping in.
Yes, out of the mine shafts into the decrepit abbey. Yeah, it's really evocative. It's really
very
unique.
Bava-esque, almost before Bava, but well, it is before Bava. He hadn't shot any color films yet in terms of films that he directed, and I think it gives it this really unusual feel. Now, granted, you could argue that this therefore belongs more to Hammer than it does to Doyle in that sense, the whole sacrificial altar aspect to it. But it works, and let's face it, I think that anything that distracts from the fact that the dog is always going to be a problem. I say the dog, the hound, with or without phosphorus, is just never quite as frightening as you want it to be. I think now, if you decided to do a full-blown version of it, you could probably make it absolutely work, but it has to look like a real dog. You have to believe it, and obviously dogs can be scary and so on and so forth, and for different reasons. But when you get a good look at it on camera, and I think they did all kinds of things. They talked about staging certain shots in equivalent of miniatures, where you'd have the dog in makeup.
Famously, I believe they had some children dress up as Cushing and Lee and made it look like the hound was enormous
gigantic,
to them. And they said that they got the film back and it looked like the dog was attacking some children. It just didn't look right.
Funnily enough. Also worth saying, of course, that one of the very best things about it actually is that Christopher Lee, who's in it, and he's very good in it, and he gets to be the romantic lead. That just doesn't happen. Certainly doesn't happen at Hammer.
I think he is excellent as Sir Henry in this film. As you say, he's playing the romantic lead, something that really doesn't happen very often in his career, and certainly seldom at Hammer, unless you count Dracula as the romantic lead of the films that he's...
Fair point.
But I think what's really interesting about Lee's Henry Baskerville, which is in stark contrast to, say, Richard Green in the Rathbone version, or Martin Shaw, who is in the later Ian Richardson made-for-TV movie, is Lee's Sir Henry is, at least in my mind, rather cold and standoffish. They make, I think, a point of really connecting the way that he interacts, especially in his love scenes with Maria Landy's Cecile. They draw a line between him and David Oxley's Sir Hugo. They are centuries removed from one another, but there still is this hint of the landed gentry who is going to use his quote-unquote property as he so chooses. And it's by no means a new read to say that Hammer films are being subversive in their rather jaundiced view of the upper classes, and how Count Dracula is an aristocrat who is literally preying upon those who are below him. But you sort of get a little bit of sympathy out of the way that they have recontextualized Stapleton and now his daughter, as opposed to his wife or sister. Obviously, they're still evil in the end, and they get their comeuppance, but I think it's an interesting read that it's not quite as black and white as even the Doyle representation of that character is. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that partly that's just, I suppose, Christopher Lee's character. I think a tendency to have slightly haughty, superior demeanor, not just because he's tall, dark, and very, very tall. You're quite right there. I think that it fed in to that aspect of the Hammer films, after all. I think there was always that element of it where they tended to have a somewhat critical view of the aristocracy, in the sense that Frankenstein is not exactly the hero in that sense. He's kind of more of a villain. And yet at the same time, you're following his story. And as you say, Dracula is technically an aristocrat.
Absolutely,
and he's definitely the monster. He's also a sexy monster. So I think what you get is a real kind of ambivalence there. And it's a little bit of having your cake and eating it. Because I think what you're reflecting is, well, this is the 1950s. It's the late 1950s. It's John Osborne era. So on the one hand, there's this less deferential attitude towards the upper classes. And that's kind of cupping out. But, because there's an element of populism and vulgarity about aspects of the Hammer approach. I think that's just true. But at the same time, well, not at the same time, but I think what that tends to function as is a stick to poke the bear with. And I think people instinctively understood that and reacted positively to that. And so he's falling in line with that. I still think that he's fundamentally playing, he's aristocratic nonetheless, but he is playing a romantic lead, which is just nice. Functionally, that's the role he's playing. Also, because he gets he gets let down, let's face it.
They do give him a heart condition, which is not canonical. So he's playing a jeopardized character already. So you have to imagine that Lee really did sink his teeth into this unique opportunity.
Pardon the pun, dear listener.
Pardon the pun. You know what? I didn't even intend that.
I sometimes wonder if it's a little bit of... Have you seen Le Diabolique?
Yes.
They ended up making rather large number of films, all written by Jimmy Sangster, which were derived to some extent from Diabolique and the success of Psycho, but really the plot and dynamics of Diabolique. And in a way, I think having him have that heart condition, if you flip the narrative, it's the sort of idea of what's happening in Diabolique a little bit.
Sure.
You know, you're going to scare somebody to death, basically, and inherit. Now, okay, that's not only from Le Diabolique, but, you know, Taste of Fear wasn't very far away.
Sure.
They'd already made The Snorkel, which often isn't seen as being part of that cycle. I disagree respectfully. But I agree with you. I think what they do is they make the character both more interesting, but he's still credible in the universe of that story. And I think you're really right to point that out, because I think that that's what actually gives it extra strength, particularly because it's not like Sherlock and Watson necessarily. They often don't particularly love their clients, shall we say.
Sure.
And here there's an interesting...
There's a little bit more friction than normal. So I'd like to use that as a segue to talk about Morell and Cushing. Obviously, Morell, I believe, went on record as being very proud of his work in this film because he was doing his utmost to not follow in the Nigel Bruce tradition. His Watson is very stalwart and very serious, not without a twinkle in the eye as the canonical Watson is. And I think it's a really beautifully done piece of characterization, but I do want to use it, actually going backwards for a minute, as a half-hearted defense of Nigel Bruce's Watson, because it's so easy to lob the accusations against Bruce that he has besmirched the legacy of this great literary character and reduced him to a fool. And there are certainly moments in the later Universal films that are hard to reconcile. We don't have to, cite specific examples. If you've seen them, you know what we're talking about.
House Affair.
Absolutely.
Moving on.
But I think it's very true to say that until Nigel Bruce took the part of Watson, that the character was not regarded as very important. He was simply the narrator. Yes, he had more agency and more to do on the page than, say, the Van Dyne character in the Philo Vance novels, who almost doesn't exist on the periphery. But Watson was never as much of an active participant. And I think when you revisit some of the original stories, there's a surprising number. I'm thinking in particular of the original The Crooked Man, where Holmes shows up at Watson's house and sits in a chair and just sort of talks about the case to Watson. And then in the closing pages says, do you want to come with me and see what happens now that I've essentially figured the case out? There's a lot of that in the original stories that had to be recontextualized and adapted by writers who I think in the first half of Holmes's cinematic career that there wasn't a willingness to do. And so Watson becomes a side character who doesn't have a whole lot of agency or who doesn't have a whole lot to do on screen. I'm thinking of not that Ian Fleming, but Ian Fleming, who played Watson to Arthur Wantner's Sherlock Holmes in the 1930s, whose whole purpose, it seems, is to stand on the side of the screen and sort of just go, that's amazing, Holmes, or how extraordinary.
Amazing, Holmes. Oh, it's elementary, my dear Watson, elementary.
Nigel Bruce at least gave Watson something to do. And after Bruce gave Watson a character, it would be impossible to have Holmes appear on screen without his sidekick. And so I think that's very important. And to bring it back to Morell in Hound of the Baskervilles, you need a characterization as strong as his to really hold those middle minutes of the film together. What Hammer does nicely that most other Hound of the Baskervilles adaptations do not is they do manage to condense the time that Holmes is not on screen. So we don't have to wonder where he is and when he's coming back. And obviously, with Peter Cushing as Holmes, you want as much time with him as possible. I like to say that Cushing is probably my favorite screen actor. I love watching him work. And he's, renowned for his little ticks. As you already pointed out, he does a lot with the right index finger. As an actor myself, I often find myself doing a Peter Cushing finger in performance. It's a habit I can't break. But he is really extraordinary in this film. And some critics and historians have said that there's not much of a difference between his Professor Van Helsing and his Sherlock Holmes. But I think that the performance is nicely calibrated. It's nicely realized. His Holmes is a lot pricklier than his Professor Van Helsing. In fact, I think you could make the case that his Holmes is a little bit too standoffish and a little bit too distant. There's a nice moment when he is intentionally goading Lee's Sir Henry, telling him that he doesn't like the kind of company that he's keeping, and he should, if he's going to defy his orders to go across the moor at night, then he might as well go spend the night with his peasant friends. And you sort of wonder how much performance Cushing is really doing as Holmes in that moment. From what we've seen at this point, that characterization is not all that far from the Holmes that he's been playing up to that point, if that makes any sense. And you sort of get the impression, and it's a little bittersweet in hindsight, you get the impression that Cushing would have continued playing Holmes under a number of circumstances, and the opportunities that he had to do so never quite matched with what he was bringing to the character. Obviously, we think about Rathbone as the definitive Holmes of this period of time. But Rathbone was not indebted to the history of the character the way that Cushing was. Cushing was that kind of actor already, that he was going to be making these notes in his script, that he was going to want to bring as much realism and fidelity to the parts that he had as he could. He famously, as Baron Frankenstein, would perform operations on heads of cabbage, so he would know what to do as he was sawing heads open to remove brains. But Cushing loved the Sherlock Holmes stories, and so he wanted to bring a truthfulness to his performance that was in line with what was written on the page. And it's sad that this Hound of the Baskervilles was not a big enough a success, that Hammer didn't go forward with other additional Holmes adaptations, because the next time that we see Cushing as Holmes, it's in what I perceive as the rather ill-fated BBC series from 1968 and 1969.
I take it that you have read the article since you have marked it, eh?
Yes, I've read
Well, what rubbish, eh?
You think so?
Here is a fellow who insists that by a person's fingernails, his coat sleeve, boots, shirt cuffs, knees of his trousers, that any halfway intelligent man can tell at a glance his history or trade or profession to which he belongs. Well, I admit that you, Holmes, from time to time have surprised me with your remarkable powers of observation, but even you would never make such a sweeping generalization.
Oh, but I would. What's more, I do.
Oh, come now.
I wrote that article myself.
It's really hard to judge that series now because only, I think, 4 episodes survive. The rest are lost to time in the way that a lot of Doctor Who of the same period is. But you look at his performance in that show and you see all of the backstage turmoil that was going on in his performance. It's compromised in the way that you wish that it had not been. And then the last time he played the role was in 1984. He did a made-for-TV movie called Sherlock Holmes and the Masks of Death, in which he plays a semi-retired Sherlock Holmes, who is solving a mystery on the eve of World War I. And it's a perfectly adequate TV film produced by Tyburn Productions, now owned by Hammer. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed for a 4K restoration of Sherlock Holmes and the Masks of Death. But again, it's not the perfect circumstance under which you wish that this actor who had so much enthusiasm for the part and who knew the part so well and had a history of playing it so well could have done it.
It's weird how that show became a sort of production nightmare, I think, in lots of ways. And you sort of look at that thinking, how tough could it have been? This is the kind of thing that BBC was really good at. And actually, they just were going all over the place and really couldn't quite get... And some of that probably had to do with the Doyle estate as well, and what you could and couldn't do and things like that. And I think they were hamstrung. And from that point of view, in fact, you could argue Cushing may not have been the right person to be in place, because I think with his desire to be sort of strictly faithful, that might not have been quite what they wanted to do. Because also they were facing that usual problem, that if you did the stories, the short stories, I mean, they did do a Study in Scarlet as well, but if you just do the short stories, it's actually very hard to turn them into an hour of television, even if you're being very faithful. They're just too short. They just don't fit. You know, you have to do other things to make it work dramatically, and I think that's a toughie. But yes, I think the 1959 Sherlock Holmes that he does do, he gets to do the most famous of the novels. I don't think it's the best of the novels. I think that the best of the novels is The Sign of the Four, or The Sign of Four, which indeed is the film that, if things had gone better with Hammer, it would have been the film that would have followed The Hound of the Baskervilles. That's the rumour. I think what happened was it didn't do particularly well in America. Isn't that the perception? I don't know if that's true or not. The next film on your list is one of the first examples of what has become a subgenre within the Sherlock Holmes pastiche. It's in no way reflected in the short stories or any of the four novels. So we're looking at a film called A Study in Terror with John Neville, who I think is a phenomenal Sherlock Holmes.
Who was Jack the Ripper? Only one man thought he knew the answer. His address?
221B Baker Street, please, cabby.
His name was Sherlock Holmes.
I have reason to assume a connection between this case of surgical instruments and your local murders, Mr. Baker.
That's slender. Talk like that can get you sued.
No, sir. Talk like that can get you hanged.
Sherlock Holmes, a genius at detecting the improbable and solving the impossible.
Incredible. Elementary, my dear Watson.
Before we began recording, we were talking about the great Sherlock Holmes on Screen book, which is written by Alan Barnes with some contributions from Andrew Lane and Jonathan Rigby. And if anyone is interested, they should look to this book for a really comprehensive story of its origins and its production. The long story short is that this movie was originally sort of envisioned as an exploitation film, and you get some of that in this film still. There are shock horror scenes of the Ripper murders that feel indebted to Peeping Tom or Psycho, and you get some very garishly dressed women as the Ripper victims who have nothing to do with the historical counterparts that they represent. But what is really interesting, I think, juxtaposed to all of that, is just how true the representation of Sherlock Holmes is in this film. And John Neville really is excellent at walking the line between presenting the character in the mode that I think would have been more suited to a film of this kind in the excellent English Gothic, also by Jonathan Rigby. He sort of talks about that Neville's Holmes is a little bit John Steed-ish of the Avengers, that there's a little bit of dapper gentleman about Neville's Holmes, but he's also a man of action. This is the first Holmes on this list who, gets into a scrape with some ruffians in an East End alleyway. He's carrying his sword stick that helps him fight them off. He's also roguishly amusing. He and Watson show up at a bar dressed like they're going to the opera, and you get the sense that this is a practical joke that Holmes is playing on Watson. But he's very true to the original character. This is not a Holmes who feels at home in a exploitation setting. This still is the canonical Holmes, and I think it also deserves to be on this list as the first of the, as you say, the subgenre of Holmes versus Jack the Ripper films. But did you allude to the fact that you're not such a fan of this film, Sergio?
Well, what I was going to say is that, as you rightly point out, I mean, I think it's a film very much of its time. It's to do with just the company it was made for, which was Special Compton, which was kind of specialized in exploitation films. They actually ran their own cinema. They tended to show these, kind of horror, kind of exploitation type titles. And here we've got a film that begins in the most sort of trademark style way, of a Jack the Ripper story, which is Lady of the Night walks on the street, turns around and says, oh, hello, Ducky. It's the kind of thing they make great fun of in Amazon Women on the Moon, when it's, I don't know if you remember, where it's the Loch Ness Monster.
The Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah, and, which I thought, I think Joe Dante directed that one. It is very funny. And it reminded me a little bit of that, rewatching it just ahead of our chat.
Is this the way it happened? Was Jack the Ripper, in fact, a 60-foot sea serpent from Scotland? Did I take this job for a quick buck? We may never know the answer to these questions. Next week.
It is, I think, the first movie to genuinely do Jack the Ripper versus Sherlock Holmes. I think. It may have been done in other formats, but it was, I think, the first time that had been done. So these two iconic figures, one fictional, one real, of the Victorian era. And from that point of view, I wish the opening bit felt a bit less 60s, because what it kept reminding me of, and you and I have talked about this as someone who enjoyed those kinds of things, has been those 1960s creamies that are coming out of Germany, ostensibly based on Edgar Wallace or his son's books, Brian Edgar Wallace, because they were set in contemporary 60s London, according to them, but all shot in Germany. But it's got cobble streets, it's got fog. They're kind of imagining that Victorian England never really ended and just sort of kept going into the 1960s with miniskirts and pop songs on the radio. And this occasionally feels like that. That's partly just because of the usual problem, makeup and look and so on and so forth. It's a question of approach. The opening murder, she gets a knife through the neck sideways, which, I mean, don't try this at home, folks. That's a very hard way to kill anyone, because you got a great big piece of bone right in the middle, and if you put it that way, you're fine, but sideways, not so much. And then we get Barbara Windsor, and then the titles start, and John Cameron, who's a very fine British composer and who would later do the music for the 1980s Philip Marlowe TV show with Powers Booth, and came up with a fantastic period style hard-boiled theme tune for that, which I love. But here it has this weird 60s feel. And obviously
it's all bongos,
yeah,
which is really odd.
It's very odd. Also, it does that thing where it's setting the period slightly unconvincingly and it's showing as much of denizens of, that part of London. It's, you get to see people in bars and it's sort of everybody's having a good time. What it means is that weirdly, in the first 18 minutes of the film, you get one scene with Holmes and Watson. And that's, you get Watson reading the paper about the crimes and Holmes looking for his pipe. And that's the only bit you get with them. And you got to wait nearly 10 minutes for that. And then they're off. And then there's about another 8 minutes or seven or 8 minutes of more murders and so on. And then you get Frank Finlay turning up as Lestrade. And then eventually, in a way, it's quite nice. It's that kind of standard thing. They're the heroes of the film and you're going to delay their entrance. But it always feels like there's something slightly haphazard because of the kind of exploitationally element. You kind of have to have quite a lot of kind of crass vulgarity, bits of violence. You know, you have to have these very, low cut dresses, all this kind of stuff. And because you know that that's really who they were aiming it at. And yet, as you rightly say, in actual fact, in terms of the writing of the duo, and particularly the playing of John Neville, who of course later, became a huge name in Canada and is my absolute favourite Baron Munchausen ever. He's wonderful in Terry Gilliam's film. They're great when they're on screen, and it's just really annoying that you have to wait that long to get there. They're great, and when they're on, it's going, I think, really well.
I'm inclined to agree a little bit that you do. Again, I was never intending that the exploitation roots of this film are non-existent. They do sort of butt up against the Holmes and Watson.
It's definitely an exploitation film, Nick. I don't think we're going to disagree about that. That isn't at all a bad thing.
Not at all.
This is a modestly budgeted movie, and to do a modestly budgeted period film is always hard work. You've always got to give them credit.
Difficult.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of where we're sort of putting this film historically speaking, it is the first appearance of Mycroft Holmes on film, and he's wonderfully played by Robert Morley.
Mr. Mycroft Holmes will certainly wish to take charge of the investigation himself.
Prime Minister?
I think you know the Home Secretary.
I knew your predecessor, sir. No doubt I shall soon be making the acquaintance of your successor, unless the police do a good deal better than they're doing at the moment.
I have every confidence in the police.
That must be, sir, why there's none left in the House of Commons.
Mycroft, I sent for you because you have the tidiest and most orderly brain in Her Majesty's civil service.
Prime Minister, I cannot deny it.
What do you think about the ending? Not that we particularly want to give away the endings, but it has an exceptionally cheeky ending. One bound and he was free. I'm being slightly mean. I mean, hey, it's got Dame Judi Dench in it in a very early role, and Barbara Windsor. I mean, you got to admit, if you were doing the film quiz type thing, what's the film co-starring Barbara Windsor and Dame Judi Dench? I think not a lot of people would get this, so I think it deserves props for that. But what do you think about the ending? Tell me the truth.
I also think it is a little bit of a cop-out ending. I would like to know how he got out of that burning building. But the film does sort of gain points for me in the end, that we get a nice rendition of a scene from The Blue Carbuncle as Holmes begins making some deductions about a bowler hat, and that's how we send these characters off in this film. It's a nice little homage to the originals.
Worth pointing out that until very, very recently, the material was considered under copyright, particularly in the US, where they potentially could extend it far too long. It's now well and truly out of copyright, but until extremely recently, you did have to get the okay from the Doyle estate, and you did have to pay them a fee. So to a certain extent, I think the fact that they are sensibly also drawing from canonical works, I think shows great savvy. By the way, you know about the novelization? You and I think have talked about it in the past. So it's got this novelization credited to Ellery Queen. I don't know if you've read it. It's not bad. It's a very interesting idea because you get the Ellery Queen character in the modern day, as it would have been in the 1960s, receiving a manuscript and opening up and having to make certain deductions about the manuscript. Then you get the story of the film, and then you get Ellery Queen at the end coming up with some other stuff at the end. And the way it was done is that Ellery Queen, meaning the pseudonym for Manfred Lee and Frederick Danny, wrote those bits, the bits with Queen. But the actual core novelization in the middle was actually written by a guy called Paul W. Fairman, who was a very busy writer. Actually did a lot of science fiction. And it's a perfectly fun read. And in fact, I read that way before I ever saw the movie. So that was kind of in my head. I actually thought it was based on it when I was a kid. I didn't realize it was a novelization. Yeah, so there you go. So a bit of a disappointment there. But I do think all the pluses of that film, I mean, it's got a great cast as well. Anthony Quayle's in it, doing well. And of course, we'll get to Anthony Quayle again. But, so I think that it's, in a way, having just been a little bit mean about it. In actual fact, this almost feels like a Sherlock Holmes film that is way better than it ought to be. Given the way that it's positioned as this kind of exploitation, unlikely exploitation, in a kind of sub-Hammer mold, I suppose.
Absolutely.
And yet, actually, it's doing the Sherlock Holmes stuff, which is the hardest thing to get right. It's doing that mostly very well indeed.
I think you've summed up my impressions of it beautifully. That's exactly the case that I was making for it, and certainly inclusion on this list. I have read the novelization. It's been a very long time since I read it, and without saying anything, they changed the ending, which I think is rather interesting and unique. You certainly wouldn't get away with a novelization like that today.
Well, that's fantastic, Nick, but I think we're going to have to hold it there because this has turned into a very exciting episode and we're going to have to do it in 2 parts. So on a cliffhanger, Nick, thank you so much for joining me for part 1 of your top 10 Sherlock Holmes movies.
Thank you, Sergio. It's always a pleasure.
Can't wait to see you very shortly to do the other half and find out who wins. Take care, mate.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.